Lady Beatrice Harcourt stood rigid as marble beneath the grand chandelier of Blackwell House, the whispers circling her like vultures. Her mother's silver brooch, a cameo of delicate blue, trembled upon her breast with each laboured breath. The candlelight caught the emerald of her engagement ring, a token that had adorned her finger for precisely 7 days before this moment of reckoning. She was seen with another man. Lady Charlotte Whitmore's voice carried across the ballroom, sweet as poison. In the gardens at dusk, no less, quite unchaperoned. The dance cards fluttered, the orchestra faltered, the ton's collective gaze fixed upon Beatrice, who stood alone in a sea of pale silk and judgment. A promised woman, someone murmured, entrusted with a duke's honour. Beatrice clutched her reticule, fingers white against the embroidered fabric. "I have broken no vows," she declared, though her voice barely carried beyond the first circle of onlookers. "There has been a grievous misunderstanding." The ballroom doors swung open with ceremonial weight, and the assembly parted like water before flame. Alexander Blackwell, the Duke of Blackwell, stood framed in the doorway, his expression a study in controlled fury. His black tailcoat was immaculate, his cravat pristine, his gloves so white they seemed to glow against the shadows of the corridor behind him. Upon his finger, the signet ring of his ancient house caught the light as he slowly, deliberately, removed his right glove. "Your Grace," Lady Charlotte curtsied, her voice honeyed with false sympathy. "How grievous that you should return to London to such distressing news." The Duke's gaze never left Beatrice. "I returned early from Lancashire to surprise my betrothed," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room. "It seems I am the one surprised." Beatrice took a step forward. "Alexander, I implore you." "The evidence has been presented to me," he interrupted, and the room grew impossibly quieter. "Multiple witnesses attest to your meeting with a gentleman in the garden pavilion. You were observed in close conversation for over half an hour." A gasp rippled through the assembly. In high society, such a meeting was tantamount to impropriety of the highest order. The man was Sir Edward Harcourt, a distant relative newly arrived from— "Spare me your fabrications," the Duke snapped, his voice cutting through her explanation like a blade. "I have been patient, I have been generous, I have been made a fool." The orchestra members lowered their instruments. The dancers froze in their positions. Mothers drew their daughters closer, while gentlemen exchanged knowing glances. This was the theatre of scandal they secretly craved, a duchess-to-be fallen from grace. "Your Grace," Beatrice tried again, her voice steadier now, "I have not betrayed your trust. I swear upon my mother's memory." The Duke raised his hand, silencing her. From his waistcoat he withdrew a folded paper sealed with the Blackwell crest. "I had intended this as a marriage settlement," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a judge's sentence. "Instead, it shall serve as notice of our dissolution." He tore the document in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed like thunder in the silent ballroom. "The engagement is broken," he proclaimed. "Let it be known throughout London that Lady Beatrice Harcourt is no longer under the protection of Blackwell." Beatrice felt the floor tilt beneath her. The silver brooch at her breast seemed suddenly heavy as lead. She touched it with trembling fingers, seeking strength from the only piece of her mother she had left. "If I am to be judged," she said, her voice rising with newfound clarity, "let it be by truth, not by whispers." "The truth stands before us all," the Duke replied coldly. "You have broken faith. You have dishonoured my name before it ever became yours." Lady Charlotte stepped forward, her pink gown rustling with self-importance. "Your Grace, perhaps in private—" "No," the Duke interrupted. "What was to be celebrated in public shall be severed in public. I will not hide behind closed doors what she has done in open gardens." Beatrice stood alone in the centre of the room, surrounded by judgment, abandoned by mercy. The emerald ring weighed upon her finger like a shackle. With quiet dignity, she removed the ring and placed it upon a silver tray held by a nearby footman. "A Harcourt may lose a title," she said, her voice carrying clear as a bell, "but never surrenders her truth." She turned towards the door, her cream silk gown whispering across the polished floor. As she reached the threshold, she paused, looking back over her shoulder at the man who had claimed to love her. "Remember this moment, Your Grace," she said softly, "when you discover what your pride has cost you." Then she was gone, leaving behind nothing but the lingering scent of lavender and the weight of unspoken truths. The ton erupted into murmurs. The Duke stood motionless, the torn paper still clutched in his gloved hand as the ballroom doors closed upon the woman who would have been his duchess. The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the carriage windows as Lady Beatrice Harcourt journeyed farther from London with each passing mile. Her trunks, hastily packed in the grey dawn after that fateful night, were strapped to the modest hired brougham, their leather surfaces darkening in the persistent downpour. Inside, Beatrice sat rigid, her hand clutching her mother's silver brooch, her gaze fixed on the passing countryside that grew wilder as the city receded. "Miss," her lady's maid Martha whispered, concern etched upon her weathered face, "we must find shelter soon. The roads grow treacherous in this weather." Beatrice nodded, her throat too tight for words. 3 days had passed since her public humiliation at Blackwell House. 3 days of hurried arrangements, of letters sent to her aunt in Yorkshire, of tears shed in private chambers while maintaining dignified silence in the face of servants' pitying glances. "There is an inn ahead," the driver called through the small window. "The White Stag, respectable enough for a lady, I should think." "Any port in this storm?" Beatrice murmured, gathering her cloak about her shoulders as the carriage slowed. The White Stag Inn stood half hidden by ancient oaks, its windows glowing amber against the grey afternoon. As the carriage halted, Beatrice observed another vehicle already waiting in the courtyard, a handsome black landau with a coat of arms obscured by mud splatter. A footman hurried forward with an umbrella. Beatrice descended with careful dignity, mindful that even in disgrace, a lady's comportment must never falter. The inn's common room was warmed by a generous fire. Several travellers glanced up at her entrance, their gazes curious but quickly averted when they noted her quality. All except one, a gentleman who sat in the corner, his long legs stretched before him, his expression one of amused interest. "Landlord," Beatrice addressed the proprietor, her voice soft but assured, "my maid and I require lodging for the night." As arrangements were made, she felt the gentleman's gaze remain upon her. He was handsome in a dangerous fashion, fair-haired with sharp features, and a mouth that curved in perpetual cynicism. His attire spoke of wealth worn carelessly, a fine coat with a button missing, an expensive cravat tied with deliberate looseness, a heavy gold ring with a blood-red ruby that caught the firelight. "Lady Beatrice Harcourt," he said suddenly, rising from his seat with exaggerated courtesy. "What an unexpected pleasure to find London's most recent sensation seeking refuge in my humble hunting grounds." The common room fell silent. Beatrice froze, her reticule clutched tightly in her gloved hands. "You mistake me, sir," she replied coolly. "I am not acquainted with you. But I am most thoroughly acquainted with your circumstances," he countered, approaching with a predator's grace. "Lord Damien Redgrave, at your service. The scandal sheets speak of little else but your precipitous departure from the Duke of Blackwell's protection." Martha stepped closer to her mistress. "Sir, you forget yourself." Lord Redgrave smiled, revealing teeth too white, too even. "On the contrary, madam, it is London that forgets its fallen daughters so quickly." "I have not fallen," Beatrice stated, her chin lifting. "I stand precisely where truth places me." "Magnificent," Redgrave murmured. "Such dignity in exile. Tell me, does Blackwell know what he has cast aside?" "The Duke's knowledge or ignorance is no longer my concern," Beatrice replied, moving toward the stairs that would lead to her chamber. Redgrave stepped into her path. "Perhaps not, but I offer sanctuary, Lady Beatrice. My estate lies but 10 miles from here, comfortable, discreet, and far from prying eyes. A lady in your position might find such an arrangement beneficial." Beatrice regarded him steadily, recognizing the danger that lay beneath his charm. "I find nothing beneficial in further compromising my reputation, Lord Redgrave." "Your reputation," he laughed softly. "My dear, that fragile vessel has already shattered upon the rocks of Blackwell's disfavor. I merely offer to collect the pieces." "Even broken glass can cut, sir," she replied. "And I am not so desperate as to seek shelter with a stranger whose reputation precedes him." His eyes narrowed. "You know of me, enough to maintain distance. Now, kindly step aside." For a moment, tension hung in the air between them. Then Redgrave offered an exaggerated bow. "As you wish, my lady. But the night is long, the storm fierce, and your future uncertain at best." As Beatrice climbed the stairs to her chamber, she felt the weight of his gaze following her ascent. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. She paused at the landing, looking back at the common room now returning to its normal bustle. Lord Redgrave raised his glass to her in silent toast, his ruby ring gleaming like a drop of blood against the crystal. In her room, with Martha bustling about to prepare for the night, Beatrice stood at the window watching the storm lash the countryside. Somewhere in London, Alexander Blackwell was likely sitting in his study, perhaps already forgetting the woman he had so publicly discarded. She touched her mother's brooch, seeking comfort in its familiar contours. "What would you counsel, mother?" she whispered to the empty air. "How does one rebuild when the foundation has been swept away?" The wind howled in reply, offering no answers, only the promise of a long night ahead. Dawn broke reluctantly over the White Stag Inn, pale light filtering through rain-washed windows. Lady Beatrice sat at her small writing desk, penning a careful letter to her aunt in Yorkshire. The quill scratched softly against the paper, forming words that revealed little of her true circumstance, while ensuring her relative would expect her arrival. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Martha entered with a tray of breakfast and a troubled expression. "My lady, that gentleman, Lord Redgrave, he inquires whether you will join him in the private parlour this morning." Beatrice set down her pen. "You may inform him that I shall break my fast in my chamber, and that I expect to depart within the hour." Martha hesitated. "There is another matter, miss. A rider arrived just now, seeking you specifically." Beatrice's heart quickened. "From the Duke?" "No, my lady. The gentleman gives his name as Sir Edward Harcourt." The silver brooch at Beatrice's throat seemed suddenly heavy. Sir Edward, her distant cousin, newly returned from Italy, whose innocent meeting in the garden had sparked her downfall. The man whose existence the Duke had refused to acknowledge. "Send him up, Martha. Propriety be damned." The maid's eyes widened at such uncharacteristic language, but she nodded and withdrew. Moments later, Sir Edward Harcourt stood in her chamber doorway, rain-damp and travel-worn. He was of medium height, with earnest brown eyes and a scholar's countenance. His attire, though quality, showed the rumpled evidence of hasty travel. "Lady Beatrice," he bowed deeply, "forgive this intrusion. When I learned what transpired at Blackwell House—" "You could have spared yourself the journey, Sir Edward," she interrupted, remaining seated. "The damage is quite thoroughly done, which is precisely why I have come." He stepped into the room, removing his hat. "The misunderstanding must be corrected. I shall go to the Duke myself and explain our meeting." Beatrice laughed, a sound devoid of mirth. His Grace made it abundantly clear that he has no interest in explanations. He preferred judgment to truth. "Then he shall hear truth from a man's lips, if a woman's testimony holds no weight with him." Edward's jaw tightened. "Our conversation in the garden concerned only family matters, your mother's connection to the Italian branch of Harcourt's. There was nothing improper." "Propriety lies in perception, sir, not reality," Beatrice replied, rising to face the window. "London has already rendered its verdict." A commotion from below drew their attention. Raised voices echoed from the inn's common room, followed by heavy footsteps on the stairs. The door burst open without ceremony, revealing Lord Redgrave, his face flushed with what appeared to be genuine anger. "So this is your virtue, Lady Beatrice," he sneered, glancing between her and Edward. "Entertaining gentlemen callers in your private chambers, while professing such delicate sensibilities." Edward stepped forward. "Sir, you forget yourself. Remove yourself from the lady's presence immediately." "And who might you be?" Redgrave's lip curled. "Another of her cousins. She seems to collect them at an impressive rate." Beatrice felt colour rise to her cheeks. "Lord Redgrave, this intrusion is unconscionable. Sir Edward is indeed my relation." "A convenient claim," Redgrave retorted, "one the Duke found rather implausible, as I recall from the gossip sheets." Edward's expression hardened. "I am Sir Edward Harcourt, recently returned from Florence, and the lady's third cousin through her maternal line. My identity can be easily verified by anyone with access to Burke's peerage." "How fascinating," Redgrave drawled. "And your business with the lady involves being alone in her bedchamber because—" "My business," Edward replied coldly, "is to restore the honour that men like you, and yes, the Duke of Blackwell, have tarnished through assumption and malice." Redgrave's hand moved to his waistcoat, where Beatrice suspected a dueling pistol might be concealed. Strong words from a convenient relation. The tension in the room grew unbearable. Beatrice stepped between them. "Enough. Lord Redgrave, you have no claim on my time or attention." "Sir Edward, your concern is appreciated but unnecessary. I require neither rescue nor restoration." Martha appeared in the doorway, alarmed by the confrontation. "My lady, the carriage is ready." "Excellent." Beatrice gathered her gloves and reticule. "Sir Edward, if you wish to continue our conversation, you may accompany our carriage. Lord Redgrave, I bid you good day." Redgrave's face darkened. "You refuse my hospitality, yet accept his escort. The Duke would find that most illuminating." "The Duke," Beatrice replied with quiet dignity, "has forfeited any right to illumination concerning my choices." As they descended the stairs, Redgrave called after them. "The roads north are dangerous, Lady Beatrice. Highwaymen and worse. A lady travelling with only a maid and a cousin might find herself vulnerable." Edward turned, his hand resting meaningfully on his coat, where a pistol might be holstered. "The lady travels under my protection, sir. Any threat to her safety would be most unwisely ventured." Outside, the rain had ceased, though the sky remained heavy with clouds. The brougham waited, steam rising from the horses' flanks in the cool morning air. As Martha arranged the blankets within, Beatrice faced Edward. "You need not accompany us, Sir Edward. Your reputation—" "My reputation," he interrupted gently, "is of little consequence compared to your safety." And there was truth in that scoundrel's warning, if nothing else. The northern roads can be perilous. Beatrice studied him, searching for ulterior motives in his earnest face. "Why would you risk the Duke's further displeasure? He is a powerful enemy." Edward smiled slightly. "Perhaps because I value truth above fear, or perhaps because the Harcourts have always protected their own regardless of consequence." For the first time since that terrible night at Blackwell House, Beatrice felt something like hope stir within her breast. She touched her mother's silver brooch, drawing strength from its familiar presence. "Then we shall depart," she decided, extending her hand to be helped into the carriage. "Though I warn you, Sir Edward, association with me has proven hazardous to one's social standing." "Some standings," he replied, helping her into the brougham, "are worth sacrificing for principles higher than society's approval." As the carriage pulled away from the White Stag Inn, Beatrice glanced back to see Lord Redgrave watching from the doorway, his ruby ring glinting as he raised his hand in mocking farewell. She did not see the rider who departed shortly after them, spurring his horse toward London with urgent purpose. The Duke of Blackwell stood at the window of his study, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand. Rain streaked the glass, distorting the view of his manicured gardens where, not fortnight past, his betrothed had allegedly betrayed his trust. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth failed to penetrate the chill that had settled within him since that night. "Your Grace," his butler announced from the doorway, "Lord Ashford has arrived." The Duke nodded without turning. "Send him in." The Earl of Ashford, Alexander's oldest friend and confidant, entered with little ceremony. He removed his damp greatcoat, handing it to the waiting servant before approaching the fireplace. "Still brooding, I see," he observed, helping himself to brandy from the crystal decanter. "The Tun speaks of little else but your dramatic severance." "Let them speak," Alexander replied coldly. "I have no interest in gossip." "No?" Ashford raised an eyebrow. "Yet it was gossip that convinced you to cast aside your betrothed without investigation." The Duke turned, his expression hardening. "There were witnesses, William. Multiple accounts placed her in the garden pavilion with an unknown gentleman, unchaperoned, for over half an hour, and naturally, no explanation could possibly justify such a meeting." Ashford's tone was light, but his eyes remained serious. "Not even from a woman whose character had never before given cause for suspicion. You overstep," Alexander warned. "Someone must." Ashford sipped his brandy. "Have you even attempted to verify the identity of this mysterious gentleman, or did Lady Charlotte's breathless account suffice?" A muscle twitched in the Duke's jaw. Lady Charlotte merely confirmed what others had observed. "Lady Charlotte," Ashford countered, "has coveted your title since her debut 3 seasons ago. Surely that merits some skepticism regarding her motives." The Duke remained silent, staring into the amber depths of his untouched drink. "There is another matter," Ashford continued. "A rider arrived at my estate this morning with rather interesting intelligence. It seems Lady Beatrice was observed at the White Stag Inn in the company of Lord Damien Redgrave." Alexander's fingers tightened around his glass. "Redgrave? The libertine?" "The very same, though the account suggests she rebuffed his advances." "And you believe this messenger?" The Duke's voice had grown dangerously quiet. "I believe nothing without verification," Ashford replied evenly. "Unlike some." The barb struck true. Alexander set down his glass with deliberate care. "If she has fallen under Redgrave's influence, it merely confirms my judgment was sound." "Does it?" Ashford challenged. "Or does it suggest a desperate woman seeking any shelter after being cast out by the man who vowed to protect her?" "Enough." The Duke's voice cut through the room. "I did not invite you here to question my decisions." "No, you didn't invite me at all. I came because someone must speak reason to you before your pride costs you what cannot be regained." A knock at the door interrupted their tense exchange. The butler entered, bearing a silver salver with a calling card. "Your Grace, Sir Edward Harcourt requests an audience. He insists the matter is of utmost urgency." Alexander took the card, examining the unfamiliar name. "Harcourt? Any relation to Lady Beatrice?" "He claims to be her cousin, Your Grace, recently returned from Italy." The Duke and Ashford exchanged glances. "Show him in," Alexander commanded. Sir Edward entered with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to moving through society, though his attire showed signs of hasty travel. He bowed with precise formality. "Your Grace, Lord Ashford, I thank you for receiving me without appointment. You claim kinship with Lady Beatrice," the Duke stated without preamble. "I do not claim it, Your Grace. I am her third cousin through the maternal line." My branch of the family has resided in Florence these past 15 years, which explains my absence from London society. Alexander studied the man closely. And you have evidence of this connection? Sir Edward withdrew a folded document from his inner pocket. My father's correspondence with Lady Beatrice's mother, dating back 20 years. Also, family records that establish our lineage beyond question. The Duke accepted the papers, examining them with careful scrutiny. The handwriting, the seals, the dates, all appeared authentic. A cold weight began to settle in his stomach. If what you say is true, he said slowly, then your meeting with Lady Beatrice in the garden was nothing more than a family reunion, Edward finished. I had only just arrived in London. Lady Beatrice had written to my lodgings, inviting me to call upon her at Harcourt House. Instead, finding myself near Blackwell Gardens and recognizing her from family portraits, I approached her directly. Without proper introduction, Alexander's tone remained skeptical. An impropriety born of excitement, not improper intention, Edward acknowledged. We discussed my late father's collection of Italian art, which includes several pieces once owned by Lady Beatrice's mother. That was the entirety of our conversation. The Duke turned away, his face unreadable. Why did she not explain this at once? She attempted to, Your Grace, Edward replied quietly. You refused to listen. Ashford cleared his throat. There is also the matter of Lord Redgrave. Sir Edward, I understand you encountered him at the White Stag Inn. Indeed. Edward's expression darkened. He made unwelcome advances toward Lady Beatrice, which she firmly rejected. I believe he followed her from London with predatory intent. And where is she now? Alexander asked, his voice carefully controlled. Safe, Edward replied. Beyond Redgrave's reach. Beyond yours as well, Your Grace, if you intended to extend your humiliation of her. The Duke turned, his eyes flashing with sudden anger. You presume much, sir. I presume nothing, Edward countered. I witnessed the aftermath of your public condemnation. I saw a lady of impeccable character forced to flee London under a cloud of undeserved shame. These are not presumptions, Your Grace, they are facts. Silence fell over the study. The rain continued to drum against the windows, marking the passage of tense moments. If what you say is true, Alexander finally spoke, his voice strained. A grave injustice has occurred. Yes, Edward agreed simply. It has. The Duke straightened, his decision made. Lord Ashford, have inquiries made regarding Lady Charlotte Whitmore's movements and associations. Sir Edward, I request a complete account of your family connection to Lady Beatrice, with all supporting documentation. Edward bowed. Of course, Your Grace. As the two men turned to leave, Alexander spoke again. Sir Edward, if I were to seek audience with Lady Beatrice, would she receive me? Edward paused at the threshold. I cannot speak for her, Your Grace, but I will say this. Some wounds cut too deeply for simple apologies to heal. When the door closed behind them, the Duke of Blackwell returned to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens where everything had begun to unravel. For the first time since that fateful night, doubt crept into his certainty, and with it, the first stirrings of regret. The grandest ballroom in London blazed with 100 chandeliers, every crystal pendant catching and multiplying the light until the assembled nobility seemed to stand within a constellation of stars. Not since the Queen's last reception had so many members of the ton gathered under one roof. Dukes and earls, countesses and viscountesses, the cream of society arrayed in their finest silks and jewels, their collective curiosity a palpable force. At the entrance, footmen announced each arrival with ceremonial gravity. The Marquess and Marchioness of Harrington, Lord and Lady Pembroke, the Countess Dowager of Westmoreland. The grand clock struck 9, and a sudden hush fell over the assembly as the double doors swung wide. His Grace, the Duke of Blackwell. Alexander entered alone, his formal attire impeccable, his bearing rigidly controlled. The crowd parted before him, whispers trailing in his wake. For 2 weeks, London had buzzed with rumours of his investigation into Lady Charlotte's deception and his subsequent discovery of Lady Beatrice's innocence. The scandal sheets had feasted upon each new revelation. He paused at the centre of the ballroom, surveying the glittering assembly, every face turned toward him, every ear straining to catch his words. "My lords, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room, "I have requested your presence this evening to address a matter of honour and justice." In the gallery above, the orchestra waited in silence. Below, the assembled nobility held their collective breath. 2 fortnights passed. In this very society I committed a grievous error. Guided by false testimony and my own damnable pride, I publicly severed my engagement to Lady Beatrice Harcourt, casting aspersion upon her character without proper investigation. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Lady Charlotte Whitmore, standing near the refreshment table, grew visibly pale. Subsequent evidence has proven beyond any question that Lady Beatrice was innocent of any impropriety. The gentleman with whom she spoke was indeed her cousin, Sir Edward Harcourt, recently arrived from Italy. Their meeting was brief, proper in its purpose, and improperly reported by those with malicious intent. All eyes turned toward Lady Charlotte, who shrank beneath the collective gaze. The Duke continued, his voice growing stronger. "I stand before you not as a man of title defending his honor, but as a man acknowledging his grievous fault. I publicly wronged a lady of impeccable virtue, and no private apology could suffice to restore what my public condemnation destroyed." A footman approached, bearing a silver tray upon which rested a small velvet box and a sealed letter. The Duke took both, then addressed the assembly once more. "I have invited Lady Beatrice Harcourt to receive my public apology and the restoration of her good name. Whether she accepts either is entirely her choice, which I shall honor regardless of personal cost." On cue, the doors opened again. The footman's voice rang out clear as a bell. "Lady Beatrice Harcourt and Sir Edward Harcourt." Beatrice entered on her cousin's arm, her bearing regal despite the tension evident in her posture. She wore a gown of pale blue silk, the exact shade of the cameo in her silver brooch, and her hair was arranged in a simple yet elegant style that emphasized the quiet dignity of her features. The Tun watched, breathless, as she crossed the polished floor toward the Duke. Not a fan fluttered, not a jewel clinked. Even the candle flames seemed to still themselves for this moment of theatre. When she stood before him, the Duke of Blackwell, the most powerful peer in England, bowed deeply, lower than protocol required, lower than many had ever seen him bow to anyone save the Queen herself. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice pitched to carry to every straining ear, "before these witnesses I acknowledge my grievous error and the unjust harm I have caused you. No excuse can mitigate my failure, and no reparation can fully restore what was taken." Beatrice regarded him steadily, her expression composed though her eyes held storms. Alexander continued, "I return to you this." He opened the velvet box, revealing the emerald engagement ring she had surrendered, not as a renewal of our betrothal, but as a restoration of what was rightfully yours. The settlements that accompanied it remain in force, regardless of your decision concerning our future. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the assembly. Such a gesture was unprecedented, a fortune offered without the security of marriage. "The choice before you is yours alone," the Duke said, his voice growing softer, more personal. "If you wish never to see me again after this night, I shall respect your decision absolutely. If you would consider, in time, renewing our acquaintance on whatever terms you deem appropriate, I would count myself fortunate beyond merit." He extended the open box toward her. The emerald gleamed beneath the chandelier light, a perfect match to her eyes. Beatrice studied him for a long moment, her gaze penetrating. Then, with deliberate grace, she spoke, her voice clear as crystal, carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. "Your Grace, I accept your apology as it pertains to my reputation. The truth has indeed been established, and I thank you for acknowledging it publicly." She did not reach for the ring. Instead, she touched the silver brooch at her throat, drawing strength from its familiar presence. "However," she continued, "while a reputation may be restored through declaration, trust once broken requires more than words to mend. A man who would condemn without investigation, who would trust malice before loyalty, who would sacrifice love upon the altar of pride, such a man has shown the true measure of his heart." The assembly seemed to collectively hold its breath. The Duke's hand remained extended, the ring glittering between them like a question. "I cannot accept this ring," Beatrice said at last, her voice gentle but firm. "Not because I bear you ill will, but because I have learned the value of my own truth. A woman must be believed, not merely tolerated. She must be defended, not merely possessed." With graceful deliberation, she closed the Duke's fingers over the velvet box. "A man who trusts gossip before the woman he claims to love is not the man I would choose to stand beside me through life's greater trials." The Ton's reaction was immediate, a collective intake of breath, the rustle of silk as ladies exchanged glances, the soft murmur of astonishment rippling through the assembly. Never had they witnessed such a scene. A duke rejected before the entirety of society by a woman he had publicly wronged and sought to make amends with. Alexander's face betrayed nothing, though those nearest might have noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he returned the ring to his pocket. "You speak with wisdom and courage, Lady Beatrice," he said at last, "qualities I failed to honor when they most mattered." Then, to the shock of all present, the Duke of Blackwell executed another deep bow, this one directed not merely at Beatrice, but at all the assembled women of the Tun. "Let my error serve as instruction," he proclaimed. A gentleman's first loyalty must be to the truth of those he professes to cherish, not to the whispers of those who seek to destroy. I have learned this lesson at terrible cost. He straightened, meeting Beatrice's gaze once more. I wish you every happiness, my lady, whether or not I am privileged to witness it. Sir Edward stepped forward, offering his arm to Beatrice once more. She took it with quiet dignity, and together they turned to depart. As they reached the doors, the Duke's voice rang out once more. Softer now, meant perhaps more for her than for the assembly. The heart learns its truest lessons through its deepest wounds. This, too, I have discovered. Beatrice paused, turning slightly. For a brief moment their eyes met across the expanse of polished floor and watching nobility. Then, with the barest nod of acknowledgement, she departed. The ton erupted into conversation the instant the doors closed behind her, but the Duke of Blackwell stood motionless in the centre of the ballroom. His victory and his loss displayed equally before the merciless gaze of society. Spring had returned to the countryside, painting the hedgerows with blossoms and filling the morning air with bird song. 6 months had passed since that fateful night in London, when Lady Beatrice Harcourt had done what none before her had dared, refused a duke's amends before the assembled aristocracy. The cottage where she now resided sat nestled in a small vale near the Yorkshire coast, its garden fragrant with lavender and roses. Here, in the modest estate left to her by a distant aunt, Beatrice had found a measure of peace that London's glittering ballrooms had never provided. She sat in the garden, a book open in her lap, though her eyes had strayed to the distant horizon where the sea met the sky. Her mother's silver brooch caught the sunlight as her fingers absently traced its contours, a habit formed through months of reflection. "A penny for such thoughtful contemplation," came a voice from the garden gate. Beatrice looked up, a smile touching her lips, as she recognized Sir Edward approaching through the garden gate. He carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and string, his expression bright with good humor. "Thoughts are worth far more than pennies these days," she replied, setting her book aside and gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Though I admit mine were wandering rather aimlessly." Edward took the offered seat, placing the parcel on the small table between them. "I've brought news from London, along with some items I thought might interest you." He untied the string, revealing several leather-bound volumes. "My father's journals from Florence. They contain numerous references to your mother during her visit there as a young woman." Beatrice's fingers hovered over the weathered covers. "How extraordinary. I knew so little of her life before she married father. She was quite the adventuress, according to these accounts, scaling cathedral domes and exploring ancient ruins with little regard for propriety." A genuine laugh escaped Beatrice, a sound that had grown more common in recent months. How scandalized the ton would be to learn such details. "Speaking of the ton," Edward said, his tone shifting slightly, "there is other news you should know." She tensed, her hand returning to the silver brooch at her throat. "The Duke?" "Indeed. He has withdrawn from society almost entirely. Blackwell House stands shuttered, his country estates neglected. He attends Parliament when duty requires, but otherwise he isolates himself," Beatrice finished, her expression thoughtful. "And Lady Charlotte, married to a baron from Cornwall, hastily arranged after her role in the deception became known. The match is considered significantly beneath her former aspirations." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the spring breeze carrying the scent of roses around them. Beatrice found her emotions curiously balanced, neither vengeful satisfaction nor lingering regret, merely a quiet acknowledgement of justice served. "You've received another letter," Edward mentioned casually, producing an envelope from his coat pocket. "From Lord Ashford. I believe it contains yet another offer for Blackwell's proxy at court functions." Beatrice smiled faintly. "The 5th this season. The Duke's persistent absence creates complications for his obligations. Will you accept this time?" She considered the question, watching a pair of butterflies dance above the lavender. "No. My assistance would only enable his continued withdrawal. Some lessons must be fully learned, not circumvented through intermediaries." Edward nodded, understanding in his eyes. "He searches for you, you know, discreetly but persistently. Ashford mentioned as much in confidence. And yet he has not come himself," Beatrice observed. "Pride still chains him, even in remorse." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. A single rider on a magnificent black stallion appeared on the lane leading to the cottage, a gentleman in riding attire, his bearing unmistakably aristocratic, even at a distance. Beatrice's breath caught as recognition dawned. "It appears," she said softly, "that the Duke has finally found his courage." Edward rose. "Shall I send him away?" She shook her head. "No. Some conversations once begun must reach their proper conclusion." Edward bowed slightly. "I'll be in the library should you require my presence." As he departed, Beatrice straightened her simple morning dress and touched her mother's brooch for reassurance. The Duke of Blackwell dismounted at the garden gate, hesitating before entering, a man accustomed to commanding rooms now uncertain of his welcome in a humble garden. "Lady Beatrice," he said, removing his hat, "forgive this intrusion." "Your Grace," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "You seem to have travelled far from London." 3 days' journey, he confirmed, "though I would have travelled thrice that distance if necessary." She gestured to the chair Edward had vacated. "You may sit if you wish." Alexander approached cautiously, as one might approach a woodland creature that might startle and flee. He remained standing, however, seemingly unwilling to claim even that small comfort without explicit permission. 6 months, Beatrice remarked quietly. "A considerable time to formulate what you wished to say." "No time would be sufficient," he replied. "Some failings defy adequate expression." The morning sunlight caught in his dark hair, revealing strands of silver that had not been present when last they met. His face appeared leaner, the set of his mouth graver. The Duke of Blackwell had weathered his own storm in the intervening months. "Why have you come, Your Grace?" Beatrice asked directly. Surely not merely to exchange pleasantries. Alexander's gaze met hers squarely. "I come not to seek what I have forfeited. Your affection, your trust, your hand. Those treasures, once lost through my own blindness, cannot be reclaimed through mere persistence. Then what do you seek?" "The opportunity to demonstrate change," he said simply. "Not through grand gestures before society, but through the quiet work of becoming worthy of the lesson you taught me." Beatrice studied him, searching for signs of the pride that had once dominated his character. And this lesson was that a man's worth lies not in his title or his position, but in his capacity to recognize truth, particularly when that truth challenges his assumptions. He paused, then added softly, "And that love without trust is merely possession disguised as affection." A bird sang from a nearby apple tree, punctuating the silence that fell between them. Beatrice felt something shift within her chest. Not forgiveness precisely, but perhaps its distant cousin, understanding. "I have established a foundation," Alexander continued, "for young women of good family, but limited means, to provide education, security, and protection from hasty judgments such as mine. It bears your mother's name, though I sought no permission to use it. If this offends, I shall rename it immediately." "It does not offend," Beatrice replied, "though I am curious why you did not inform me of this endeavor." "Because true amends require no audience," he answered, "and because I wish to prove, to myself most of all, that I could act from principle rather than from hope of reconciliation." For the first time, Beatrice gestured toward the chair beside her. "You may sit, Alexander." He did so, placing his hat carefully on the table. Up close, the changes in him were more evident, a certain softness around the eyes, a thoughtfulness that had replaced aristocratic certainty. "I have learned to garden," she told him, watching his reaction. "To grow things with my own hands, to value what blooms without the weight of expectation." "It suits you," he said, glancing around at the thriving beds of flowers and herbs. "This peace." "It does," she agreed, "more than I ever found in ballrooms." Alexander nodded, his gaze returning to her face. "I shall not disrupt it longer than necessary. I came only to say this. Should you ever require anything at all, you need only send word. Not out of lingering obligation, but because I have sworn to honor the woman who taught me the true meaning of integrity, whether or not she remains in my life." Beatrice felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "That is most considerate. It is the least I can offer." He rose, preparing to depart as abruptly as he had arrived. "I thank you for this audience. It is more than I deserved." As he turned to leave, Beatrice found herself speaking. "Alexander." He paused, hope flickering briefly across his features before being carefully contained. "The garden path continues around the cottage to a small pond," she said, rising from her chair. "It is particularly pleasant this time of morning. Perhaps you might walk there with me before you depart." It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was perhaps the first tentative bud of something new, something that might, with proper tending and patience, eventually bloom. "I would be honored," he replied simply. As they walked side by side down the lavender-bordered path, a respectful distance between them, Beatrice felt her mother's silver brooch warm against her skin, a silent witness to this unexpected turning of the season. Behind them on the small table, the emerald ring remained in Alexander's hat, unmentioned but present, not as a demand or expectation, but as a possibility. A reminder that some vows, once broken, might eventually be remade, stronger at the mended places, and wiser for having been tested by truth. The morning sun climbed higher, casting their shadows side by side upon the garden path, separate still, yet moving in the same direction.